Clone games may seem pointless, but they're actually surprisingly important. Not only this, but they're home to some pretty cool secrets that you're gonna miss out on if you ignore these games. But before we discuss any of that, we need to establish just what a clone game is. A clone game is a pretty simple idea that I'm sure you've run into before. It's basically just a game that takes heavy inspiration from another more popular game or franchise. So, for example, a game like Blossom Tales could be considered a clone game. When you look at it next to Link to the Past, similarities become pretty obvious. It's got the classic puzzles, dungeons that give you an item halfway through that you use to beat those dungeons and the boss, and even the iconic spin attack. But clone games aren't just indies, they can be AAAs as well. And I just want to be clear, I don't think these games are bad. You're still probably going to leave a mean comment, but just know I have nothing against these games at all. Nioh could be considered a clone game as well. It's a difficult game with a very deliberate combat system and bosses that look like eldritch creatures from the abyss. It's clearly a clone of Stardew Valley. So now that we know what a clone game is, let's talk about why they're so important and just what they're hiding. Since we already mentioned Zelda earlier, let's start with that by talking about their release windows. If you're a fan of the Zelda series or even just an observant outsider, you'll know that Zelda games don't release very frequently. In fact, the last Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, came out nearly 6 years ago. And there's no real way to avoid this. Great games just take time to make. You can look at the development cycle of the best games of all time, and very rarely will you find one that took less than 3 years to make. So the question becomes, what do we do during these droughts? Well, this is the first big reason why clone games are so important. Take something like Dark Souls, for example. Dark Souls 3 came out in 2016, and FromSoft wouldn't finish their next game for another 3 years with Sekiro in 2019. However, it was in this 3-year gap that we got some of the best Souls-likes ever made. Games like Nioh in 2017 and Code Vein in 2019. These games were great, and it's thanks to them that we didn't have to wait years to get that Souls-like experience. Of course, these games may not be as good as their inspirations, but if your options are no Souls game at all, or 80% of a Souls game, I think the answer is pretty obvious. And in fact, for some people, these games can even be better than the original due to changes and additions that they personally prefer. Which leads us straight into the most important aspect of clone games. Let's go back to Nioh for a second before we move on to the game that inspired this video in the first place, a game that I think is one of the best clone games ever made. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to Nioh. Nioh is a fantastic game, and while there are plenty of things that really set it apart from the traditional Souls-like, I want to talk about its most iconic system that basically defines the combat in this game, the stance change system. Most games are built around the player having access to one specific style of play. For example, you can look at something like Celeste, where every platforming challenge is based on the simple principles that you've got one jump and one dash. While there's nothing wrong with this method of design, I find that when it comes to combat, the best way to quickly improve a combat system is by doing two things. First, you add a stance change system, and second, you subscribe to mhswoocer on YouTube. Now, that second one isn't proven to work, but it's worth a shot. Anyway, stance changes totally alter how you interact with situations and allow the player to select how they want to approach each encounter. In Nioh, you've got 3 different stances: high, medium, and low. With the lowest stance, you deal the lowest amount of damage, but also have the highest evasion, while in the highest stance, the opposite is true. It's a simple system, but it adds so much to the combat as you, the player, now have the ability to gamble with a high-risk, high-reward style, or play it safe with a low stance. If you prefer this stance change system, you might even enjoy this clone game more than the original it was based on. But now let's move on to the game that inspired this video, Unsighted. Unsighted is one of, if not my favorite Zelda-like, unless you count Crosscode, which is kind of in a weird spot. It takes a ton of mechanics that I love from other games and throws them into this Zelda-like formula. Unsighted feels like Link to the Past, but released 30 years later. Which I guess it literally is. Anyway, what I mean by this is that it takes the skeleton, that general structure that defines 2D Zelda games, and adds in things like customizable combat, different weapon types, parrying, and counters, all of which help to separate this game from its inspiration. I'll start with the combat since it's one half of why this game is so incredible. You've got these syringes at the top of the screen that you use to heal yourself, and you can refill them by attacking enemies. This promotes aggression and forces you to really push yourself even when things start to look a little dicey. This approach to combat only works when the system itself has the tools to promote aggression, and like I mentioned earlier, you've got parries and counters, so those tools are readily available. Of course, being a Zelda-like, this game also forces you to use the dungeon items to beat the bosses, but they do it in a way that feels seamless and fluid. And this satisfying combat is then brilliantly contrasted with a somber story that almost makes you feel bad for fighting the way you do. But obviously I can't get into that because of spoilers. All of this takes place in a world that you can explore however you want since there's no set order for dungeons. It's just a genuinely unique and fun take on this classic formula. And that's what I think is the most important takeaway here. Sure, these games may be clones, but if we ignore them because of that fact, we run the risk of missing out on some surprisingly unique experiences that sometimes even have the ability to surpass their predecessors. Now check out this video that asks a pretty scary question. Will you ever top your favorite game?